So for most of my career, I have studied the role of various expert bodies involved in international negotiations, with the question being, what difference do they make, and by what political tactics or strategies do they go about exercising influence? And this paper project is sort of animated by a narrow self-interested impulse and a broader social welfare impulse. The first is the personal one is like, how far can this research program go, right? Has it reached its limits in current politics? And the second, the applied one, is the notion that, by and large, the organized role of science in world politics has been beneficial. So what can be done to rehabilitate it? Okay, the animating assumptions behind all of this, first of all, that respect for science, operationalized as professionals with a recognized expertise in a particular technical domain, is a social fact, right? That by and large, there is widespread respect for the authority of scientists. And they have been formally introduced to global decision-making in a variety of ways. 32 science advisory boards have been created to provide regular inputs of aspects of science to the international treaty process. Just about every country in the world has created a national environmental agency. And the EPA is one of the biggest, right? And this is an artifice of world attention to international environmental issues. And most countries also have national science advisors. So, right, science is there, science is good. Overall, crudely put, not going as far as Steven Pinker in his sort of mindless celebration of rationality, but it is the case that the application of science to global governance has been beneficial for the management of many global and transboundary environmental risks, not to mention improved public health, macroeconomic management, nuclear safety, and so on. There's variation, but issues that have had well-organized scientific involvement tend to be better managed and with broader benefits for those who are governed. Okay, so far so good. But right, the social authority of science has been systematically challenged, at least in the US and the UK, possibly more broadly. A long-standing question is on what is scientific authority based, right? It's like this is the core conceptual issue in the field in which I was trained, political science, which is, the core concept is power, right? That things get done by the exercise of influence by one set of actors over other actors. That's the paradigm, right? That's the way stuff gets done. Okay, well, with science, it's kind of curious, right? Because we accord them social authority. Governments delegate to them. Governments may even respond to the information which they are soliciting, but these scientists have no material capabilities. You know, by what means are they exercising influence? They're not organized hierarchically. It's not a market. It's a different model of political influence. And what can be done to defend and preserve the authority of science in public decision making? And the way to answer that is to understand better how the authority of science has operated so far. All right. So the quick answer to what's the form of power and influence which science offers seems appropriate for Heidelberg, because the answer is Weber, right? That the political power and influence of scientists rests on the perceived legitimacy of science based on its legal bureaucratic authority, right? So that there are a variety of reasons that different audiences have for why they will listen and adhere to scientific advice. And they all rest on the perceived legitimacy of the scientists. So the specific group that I'm looking at from the perspective of this project is the activities of experts with professional degrees in their domains of expertise. And in particular, here I'm looking at climate scientists and their role in climate change governance. The concept of influence or power is getting others to follow your advice by whatever means. And the domain of analysis for which science is likely to exercise influence or power is the domain of what the British philosopher G.E.M. Anscombe called hybrid facts. So there's a continuum of different kinds of facts. There are brute facts, which are just stuff that you see that are unproblematic. There are hybrid facts, which are understandings about domains, which are a combination of direct observation and interpretation. Economies, where, to some extent, the creation of the subject of inquiry is a consequence of the profession. Ecology is the same thing. And then you've got, at the final extreme, pure social facts as treated by John Searle, and pure social facts, things like democracy and law, are areas where the claims that are widely applied are unrelated to the material world. So you got sort of unproblematic material world, the pure world of constructivism and ideas, and between world where it isn't directly accessible, but the real world bites back eventually if you do something wrong, but somebody's got to tell you what the channels are and what the time frame is. That's environmentalism right there. All right. So the literature that I am drawing on or stealing from is political science, science and technology studies, and sociology. Okay. How much? I can't tell how much time I've got. Okay, so I will proceed to the paper, or the intentional paper, by addressing 4 points. Why science? How is science legitimized in public deliberations? What are the current challenges to scientific expertise? And what sort of counter-narratives can we consider to defend scientific expertise in the climate area? Why science? I mean, there's a lot of literature on this, with at least three foundations: the sort of functional literature that science, and this is Mokier's argument, that science is instrumental for promoting wealth and power. You can't have the Industrial Revolution without organized science. In addition, the application of science to modern public administration, if you will, enables the state to become stronger and possibly to achieve its pre-existing goals. Right? That, we've got Porter's history of demography and its important role in state building in the 19th century, because early bureaucratic states needed stable sources of revenue. So you had to be able to conduct a census and figure out who to tax so that the government could stay in business. Right? Purely instrumental reasons for the use of science and expertise. But organized science also helps the state achieve its goals in more efficient and effective ways. And science and scientists have the reputation for helping states and other political actors achieve what their pre-existing interests, as well as at times helping them identify new interests and new problems that require attention. Politically, the history of the Enlightenment and modern science, put overly simply, is that this was a political move intended to counterbalance religious and dynastic control of the Middle Ages. Right? So this was a progressive move associated with the early days of capitalism, which was trying to channel human impulses into more constructive channels. And respect for science and its use is also a social fact, in the sense that, for whatever reason, people seem to accept this now. All right. Science exercises its power through its perceived legitimacy. And it's willing deference by an audience because the audience thinks that science has something to offer. And as Steve Bernstein writes tersely, legitimacy is the glue that links authority and power. And if we think causally, legitimacy is constitutive and causal, or at least permissive, in terms of its effects. That is, that groups that are regarded as legitimate, do some process tracing, and you can see that their involvement has observable consequences on state and human behavior, as well as constituting the goals for that behavior. All right, I'm just trying to prune the forest of literature at the moment. And there are two strands in the literature about about legitimacy and claims about legitimacy. Either it's normative, That is, legitimacy is all about what we think they should do, whether or not they do it, and empirical, which is this is what they do in practice. For my purpose here, and for most of the work on the legitimacy of science, that's a false dichotomy, because legitimacy in practice is actually institutionalized norms. So you've got some debate about which normative principles are appropriate for appreciating the contribution of science. And then in practice, we can see that these are the specific concepts which are used in practice, which is where I'm hoping to get to before running out of time. Okay, now the question, so we've got this big conceptual literature on what legitimacy is. Bunch of, abstract concepts that, wouldn't it be nice if they do this? We know very little about audience effects of these claims. Does everybody share the same normative portfolio of expectations? Does it vary by country? Does it vary within country by anything? We don't know. Right? I mean, that's very little empirical work on this. There's one piece that I will discuss in just a minute. And lastly, the actual nature of legitimacy is contested because there are so many different claims about what the elements of legitimacy may be. Okay, that's not a problem, right? Because while most writers will say, here are my preferred 3 or 4 criteria of legitimacy, they also agree that these aren't exclusive, and that by and large, more legitimacy claims are going to be more persuasive than fewer, right? You just throw a bunch of stuff against the wall and see what happens. So more is better. I don't know which ones are good, but more is better. How's that for hand waving? All right. Now the one empirical survey that I have been able to find on respect for science comes from the World Values Survey, where they asked, does having experts, not government, make decisions according to what they think is best for the country a desirable way of conducting politics and making policy, right? So, it's the question of who do you trust? And although the relative degrees of confidence, you really like scientists or they're just okay, varies by country, but by and large, most citizens in, 2, 4, 6, 9 industrial, a variety of 9 countries, generally reveal some support for deferring to experts in technical decision making. Okay. I got no idea how seriously I take this data, right? Not just because of surveys, but what the question is really asking. Because it can, that question can be getting at one of 2 things, or maybe more, right? But, to my mind, it's either a straightforward question of, do you trust experts? Or is the do you trust experts a proxy for do you trust your government, right? Because if I trust my government, then I'm less likely to want to transfer responsibility to somebody else. If I don't like my government, then somebody else is better than these stupid politicians. So actually, it would be really interesting to see these results change over time, right? I wonder, for all these countries, right? I wonder what Brazil, U.S. and Brazil and Thailand. Should be some interesting changes. All right. Here's the big slide. So, if one sort of harvests the literature on legitimacy, there are 13 modal legitimacy claims that pop up. And these are clustered by input criteria, process criteria, and outcome output criteria. So the input criteria, which can be thought of as essentialist or sociological factors, include the reputation, prestige, or competence for the experts within their particular fields. And the presumption is that legitimacy is highly field specific, right? That we ask people for the stuff that they have studied. And then when they get too hubristic and start talking about stuff that they aren't professionally trained in, they lose any degree of legitimacy, right? That the legitimacy is very narrow. Think, for instance, of Linus Pauling, who won a Nobel Prize for chemistry, and in the U.S., and then he got an American chemist who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. And then he sort of went nuts and started proselytizing the benefits of vitamin C. And he had no credibility talking about nutrition when he was an expert in chemistry. The impartiality or independence of scientists contribute to their legitimacy. That is the extent to which they are speaking impartially and don't directly represent the interests of funding agencies, patrons, and so on, right? And Paul David has a brilliant article, like some journal nobody ever reads, where, you know what I'm talking about? Where he distinguishes between basically sort of different innovation systems and the credible distance between the scientists and the funders as to whether or not the scientists are likely to enjoy credibility in their countries. Right? I mean, you an incredible amount of mileage out of a simple 2x2 matrix. So it's like, how expensive is the research, and how close is the research to the core mission of the funding agency? And if it's really expensive and close to the core mission, which probably co-vary, then the experts have relatively little legitimacy because they're just seen as hired guns. But if they're in the other cells, then they're likely to enjoy more legitimacy. A really interesting opening for thinking about the conditions under which expert groups are going to enjoy legitimacy within their own countries, because it also relates to the national styles of funding research, right? So, France, where all heavily concentrated in one ministry, you in France science to have less credibility than in the United States. Okay, other input factors, They help ameliorate risk or uncertainty. They promote wealth accumulation. Their analysis resonates with broader social norms, values, or principles, which at the international level, discussions at the UN, this means abstract legal notions like national sovereignty, and possibly sustainability. Consensus probably matters. That is, whether or not the presumptive experts are speaking with one voice. And legitimacy. For groups to be legitimate at the international level, they must also be regarded as legitimate by domestic populations as well as the state or the government officials. Process whether or not the experts show respect for multiple viewpoints. They've at least presenting them, even if they can provide reasons for why some are better than others. A transparent selection process so that people can know how experts were chosen. Right? Maybe they were essentialist experts because they got a PhD in a relevant discipline, but it would be nice to know that they were chosen on merit rather than geographic distribution purely. Transparent deliberation. How do the experts figure out what their consensus is? Egalitarian inclusiveness. Who is how broadly representative is the expert group? The discursive practices that they use. They've got to use similar language, similar language to that which the audience is familiar with, which at the UN means they've got to learn an entirely new language of acronyms. Okay, and then outputs. Do they deliver the goods? And the literature on central banks, for instance, says that because most central banks lack any criteria for legitimacy whatsoever, and any of these criteria, but they deliver the goods, right? And the argument is that citizens in democratic societies are willing to tolerate, no transparency at all in return for stable prices and low rates of unemployment. Okay. I'll go through this one quickly, is that in the last 20 years, science has been weaponized by the axis of denialism. That is, there have been concerted attacks on the legitimacy and authority of science in the United States, in England, and at the UN. So I've got the cast of characters here, but I will move on for the sake of time. That one website, which is in green, which seems to make it less legible rather than more, is a website that documents public and private efforts in the US to harass, gag, and control science. in the UK, there was ClimateGate, which was the systematic persecution of climate change scientists who had worked on intergovernmental panels on climate change projects where they were asked to turn over, every email they had ever written or received in their lives. Okay, so there are sort of two underlying political forces behind the growth of climate denialism. One is what has been called sort of the growth of populist epistemology. That is sort of the new zeitgeist of, we all see this in our students, right? It's that they have more faith, I see it in my students at least, I hear stories about it from others, that they have more faith in claims based on personal experience rather than deductive claims or claims given by any authority figure. So there's this sort of deep-seated social, cultural, populist resistance to any form of expertise. And the second is instrumental or strategic by the fossil fuel industry of simply shooting the messenger. That, since Al Gore and the IPCC won the Nobel Prize, suddenly these people said, oh, maybe they're consequential. Let's remove their social authority by undermining them in any way possible. And the book Merchants of Doubt tells this story in compelling detail. That's nothing. Okay. Yeah. So very quickly, we can see legitimacy claims in practice through the lens of the 2010 reform of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the UN-administered primary science body which provides technical information to negotiators on climate change. And there was a scandal in 2009 where the IPCC publicized erroneous data about glacial melt in the Himalayas. There were complaints about the top-heavy management of the IPCC, and critics questioned the geographic distribution of scientists as well. The IPCC quickly responded by making changes in the transparency of recruitment practices, some administrative changes so that the head of the IPCC had less power, and efforts to be clearer in how the IPCC addressed uncertainty in its own reports. Essentially sort of coming up with some error bands, where the error bands contributed to understanding the degree of confidence in particular claims. The problem was that the way in which the error bands were calculated remained utterly opaque. Okay, so my observation is that the responses by the IPCC to these challenges can be seen in two ways. One is that they reflect this established list of what valid, warranted, legitimate legitimacy claims are. So they followed the blueprint. But the second point is that the IPCC defenses of its own legitimacy stressed relatively few of the universe of potential legitimacy tropes which could be used. So the suggestion, as it were, at the end is that the IPCC and people who are involved in discussions more generally about what's now called the science policy interface should use more arguments and rely on a broader array of discursive tropes when trying to make their case.